The woman's muffled screams barely registered as Jasper applied another layer of grease paint to his already perfect smile. 43 inches wide, he'd measured it precisely. In the cracked mirror of the warehouse bathroom, his reflection grinned back with impossible breadth, white paint stretching from ear to ear, crimson lips extending far beyond natural boundaries. "Almost showtime," he whispered, adjusting the ruffled collar that concealed the scars beneath. The fluorescent light flickered above, casting his 7-foot frame in stuttering shadows. His fingers, unnaturally long and double-jointed, danced with practiced precision as he perfected each detail of his appearance. From the other room the thumping had stopped. They always exhausted themselves eventually. Jasper glided through the doorway, his oversized shoes silent despite their appearance. The abandoned pharmaceutical warehouse had become his perfect stage. 5 stories of peeling paint and forgotten machinery, far enough from town that no one heard his performances. The management office on the 3rd floor served as his dressing room and private gallery. The woman, Karen, according to her driver's license, had been surprisingly easy to acquire. A flat tire staged on the lonely stretch of County Road 16, a helpful stranger in coveralls with a toolbox, and a perfectly timed moment when his back was turned. They never expected the helper to become something else entirely. She was his 4th this month. The others had been disappointing audiences. Karen hung suspended from an elaborate pulley system, zip ties securing her wrists and ankles, duct tape across her mouth. Her mascara had created perfect black rivulets down her cheeks. Mid-40s, Jasper guessed, with a kind of suburban haircut that screamed book club and white wine. Her eyes widened as he approached, the full horror of his appearance now visible in the dim warehouse light. "Do you know what separates a good clown from a great one?" Jasper asked conversationally, pulling a rolling cart beside her. Various instruments gleamed under the single bulb hanging above, not medical tools but props. Balloons, twisted wire sculptures, oversized plastic flowers. Commitment to character. He'd discovered his calling 15 years ago. Before that, he'd been Marcus Pendleton, an accountant with a failing marriage and crippling social anxiety. The transformation began at his niece's birthday party when the hired entertainment canceled. His sister had begged, and somehow he'd found himself in a borrowed costume, awkwardly making balloon animals for restless children. Something changed that day. Behind the makeup, Marcus discovered freedom. Without his face, he became someone else. Someone confident, uninhibited, and eventually someone powerful. The children had laughed and he'd felt alive for the first time. "Your type never appreciates the classics," Jasper continued, selecting a long, thin balloon from his cart. With expert hands he began twisting it into complex shapes. "You hurry past street performers. You think entertainment should come through screens. You've forgotten the value of live performance." He'd perfected his craft in solitude after losing his accounting job. The small inherited warehouse became his sanctuary and studio. 4 years he practiced contortion, sleight of hand, balloon artistry, and makeup techniques. His body changed with obsessive exercise focused on flexibility rather than strength. His hands, already naturally dexterous, became almost prehensile with constant manipulation exercises. The first abduction had been impulsive. A woman had laughed at him, not with him, as he practiced routines in the park. She'd taken his photograph without permission, mockingly captioning it for her social media. He'd followed her home, compelled by an urge he couldn't explain. Her skepticism had transformed into genuine terror during his private performance. Her reaction had been intoxicating. "Tonight's show will be interactive," Jasper announced, his voice shifting through multiple octaves as he spoke. He held up an elaborate balloon creation resembling handcuffs. "Though your role is mostly as the appreciative audience." Karen's eyes darted desperately around the warehouse's vast emptiness. The building had once manufactured pharmaceuticals before corporate mergers had rendered it obsolete. The equipment had been removed, but strange chemical stains still marked the concrete floors, and certain rooms retained the acrid scent of abandoned experiments. Perfect acoustics, though. Every sound echoed beautifully. "You're wondering if I'm going to kill you," Jasper said, his painted smile never wavering. "That's such a disappointingly predictable assumption. A true performer never reveals the finale too early." He removed something from his pocket, a smartphone. Karen's phone, actually. He held it up, showing her the screen. "Your loved ones have been texting. Worried about you. I've been responding, of course. Convincingly, I think." His fingers flew across the screen with surprising dexterity. "Just having drinks with an old friend," he read aloud. "Don't wait up." He set the phone on his cart and reached for his makeup kit. "The show must go on," Jasper said, approaching her with a brush loaded with white grease paint. "And every great clown needs an assistant." Her muffled screams were drowned out by his laughter, which rose and fell in impossible octaves, filling the vast emptiness of the warehouse with echoes that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Smoke began filtering beneath the kitchen door, tendrils of gray accompanied by the unmistakable scent of burning wood. Through windows, I observed gasoline-soaked rags positioned strategically against exterior walls, small flames already consuming them. In desperation, I barricaded myself in our bathroom, the only windowless room with substantial door locks, and continued speaking with Ryan, who assured me emergency services were en route. Smoke intensified, seeping through ventilation, making each breath increasingly laborious. Minutes before losing consciousness, I heard glass shattering, then firefighters calling my name. I awakened in Burnsville Medical Center with Ryan beside me, his expression haunted. "They found him," he whispered hoarsely. "In our basement." He had dozens of music boxes arranged in a perfect circle. He was sitting among them when the fire he started killed him. It had all begun a week earlier when Ryan and I organized an estate sale at our home. Ryan's Aunt Eleanor had recently passed away, leaving us with a basement filled with vintage collectibles and antique furniture. Our objective was straightforward: sell what we could, donate the remainder, and reclaim our storage space. The sale began predictably. Early birds arrived before sunrise, neighbors wandered through examining crystal decanters and embroidered linens, several dealers inquired about specific pieces. Everything proceeded normally until approximately 2 o'clock. A tall, gaunt man perhaps in his 70s approached our display tables without sound. He wore an immaculately pressed charcoal suit despite the sweltering heat, his silver hair slicked back severely, his complexion unnaturally pale. Unlike other browsers who conversed freely, this man maintained complete silence, methodically examining every item with meticulous attention. His gaze eventually fixed upon a particular object, an ornate music box crafted from rosewood and mother-of-pearl inlay. It had belonged to Eleanor since childhood, its intricate mechanism still functioning perfectly despite its age. Without speaking a word, he lifted it carefully, turning it over with peculiar familiarity, his long fingers caressing the surface almost lovingly. When I approached offering information about its provenance, he remained wordless. Instead, he extracted a leather wallet, counted exact bills, and departed rapidly, cradling the music box against his chest as if it were infinitely precious. Something about his intensity disturbed me profoundly, but Ryan dismissed my concerns as overthinking. We forgot him entirely until precisely 1 week later. It was Sunday evening around dusk when Ryan noticed unusual movement near our garden shed. Initially assuming neighborhood children were trespassing, he investigated cautiously while I prepared dinner. Through the kitchen window, I observed Ryan conversing with someone partially hidden behind the maple tree. Their interaction appeared tense, Ryan's posture increasingly rigid before he suddenly sprinted back toward the house, expression contorted with alarm. Bursting through the door, he locked it immediately behind him. "It's him, the man from the sale," he gasped. He was standing behind our shed just watching the house. When I confronted him, he asked whether Eleanor had left anything else from the collection. He seemed angry when I didn't understand what he meant. Ryan described how the man had clutched Eleanor's music box against his chest, identical to how he'd carried it away from our sale. Most disturbing was his parting statement: "She took things that weren't hers to take. I'm simply recovering what belongs to my family." 3 nights later, Ryan worked late at the hospital where he practiced emergency medicine. I was alone, attempting to distract myself with television when distinct musical notes penetrated the silence. The unmistakable melody from Eleanor's music box drifting upward from our basement. Paralyzed momentarily, I gathered courage and called Ryan, who immediately instructed me to leave the house while he contacted police. Grabbing my keys with trembling hands, I moved toward our front door only to discover it wouldn't open. Something blocked it externally. Authorities later discovered the man was Walter Harmon, whose family had manufactured handcrafted music boxes for generations until financial ruin forced them to sell their collection in 1973. Eleanor, 19 at the time, had purchased several pieces from their estate sale. Police found Harmon's apartment filled with recovered music boxes, each meticulously labeled with former owners' names, many of whom had died in suspicious house fires over the past 40 years. Most disturbing was Harmon's journal, detailing his reclamation project spanning decades. Each entry documented how he'd tracked down family heirlooms, purchasing them when possible, employing alternative methods when necessary. The final pages focused exclusively on Eleanor, revealing he'd stalked her for years, waiting patiently until her death to reclaim his property. We sold our home within weeks, relocating to another state, changing our names legally to sever connections with the past. Yet sometimes, particularly during autumn evenings when wind whispers through trees, I imagine I hear distant music box melodies playing somewhere just beyond hearing, a collection that refuses to remain silent despite its collector's demise. Around 2 a.m., just as I was drifting off, I heard this loud, violent pounding on the door, almost like someone was throwing their body against it. My stomach dropped, every hair on my neck stood on end. I froze in bed, waiting, hoping it would stop. It didn't. The pounding got louder, and suddenly I heard a crack like wood splintering. I realized they were trying to force the door open. I grabbed my phone, heart hammering against my ribs, and tiptoed toward the front door. As I neared it, a section of the door frame gave way, and the door burst open so abruptly that I stumbled backward. In the dim light from the hallway, I could see Marcus leading the way, his face twisted in this urgent, almost predatory expression. Behind him were the two men from earlier. They were bigger than I remembered, at least in that moment when fear was exploding in my chest. One carried something metallic that glinted in the low light, a crowbar I thought, or maybe a knife. I let out a panicked yelp and spun around, sprinting toward my bedroom. I slammed that door, locked it, then rushed straight into the bathroom and locked that door too. 2 layers of protection for whatever it was worth. My hands were shaking so bad that it took me 3 tries to dial 911. The operator's calm, practiced voice was the only anchor I had. I managed to whisper that there was a break-in happening right now, and I gave her my address. It all started a week earlier when I decided to sell my old TV on Craigslist. I just moved into my first studio apartment near Portland Community College, finally independent after years of my parents' overprotective warnings about living alone. My old TV was this small boxy thing that had been with me for a decade, and I listed it for a reasonable $75. Within a couple of hours, I got a handful of messages. Most people offered around what I'd asked, but one message really stood out. A guy named Marcus offered to pay $100, no negotiation. It was weird. In the listing, I had clearly stated I was willing to negotiate a little, but he didn't even try. Just said he was very interested, and would pay extra to pick it up right away. My parents' warnings about opening the door to strangers lingered in the back of my mind. I mean, who offers way more than the asking price on Craigslist without reason? My first instinct was to ask my friend Zoe if she'd come over and hang out while Marcus stopped by. But then I thought about how badly I wanted to show everyone that I could do this alone. After all, broad daylight with a guy who just wants to buy a TV, how bad could it be? Marcus and I agreed on 11 a.m. the following Thursday. Thursday morning came, but he never showed. Days passed with no word. Then one Sunday night, June 25th, I was about to crawl into bed when my doorbell rang. It was nearly midnight. My phone buzzed a second later, a text from an unknown number. "Hey, it's Marcus. I'm at your door. Sorry it's late." My heart skipped a beat. I walked quietly to the door and peered through the peephole. There were 3 men standing there. I recognized Marcus's face from the tiny profile picture he had sent me, though it was too dim to see him clearly. The other 2 guys looked bigger, their faces hidden in shadow, hands fidgeting inside their jacket pockets. One kept glancing nervously up and down the hallway. I quickly texted back, "Too late to do this now. Can we do it in the morning?" "Okay," he answered. "I'm so sorry. I'll come by tomorrow at 9 a.m. I could hear them mumbling outside, one voice growing agitated, but thankfully after a few tense seconds they shuffled away. The men were in my apartment now. I could hear them moving around. One of them shouted something to another, and I swear I heard them kicking through my bedroom door. The splintering of wood made my blood run cold. I cowered in the bathtub, phone clutched to my chest, convinced they would find me any second. Within minutes, though it felt like an eternity, I heard sirens. Then I heard yelling from outside, a few loud orders like, "Get down." There was a surge of footsteps in the hall. I crept out of the bathroom after a moment of quiet and found police officers in my living room. One of them came over and guided me outside to safety. The front door was ruined, hanging crookedly off its frame, and I could see some of my belongings scattered across the floor, drawers emptied onto the carpet. Later that night, the police told me they had caught Marcus and the 2 men just as they were trying to get away with a bag of my stuff. Laptop, video games, even a few pieces of cheap jewelry. They found my TV by the doorway with wires dangling, half wrapped in an old blanket I'd left out. An officer explained that Marcus and his accomplices had been flagged before for suspicious Craigslist meetups. Their method was to lure people, especially women, by offering more money than the listing price. Once they knew the person would be home alone, they'd pick a time to show up unexpectedly. If they didn't manage a smooth entry, they'd resort to breaking in. I remember the police officer looking almost sorry for me. He handed me back a pair of earrings that Marcus's group had dropped on the sidewalk. "You got lucky," he said gently. "We showed up at just the right time. The last victim wasn't so fortunate." He didn't elaborate, but the grim look in his eyes told me all I needed to know. That creeping sense of vulnerability never quite left me. Sometimes, late at night, I'll hear normal creaks and pops in my apartment walls and wonder if someone's out there testing the locks again. The terrifying thing is that you never truly know who's behind those. Standing there in that dimly lit cabin, I realized I was looking at someone who had deliberately infiltrated my life to tear it apart. Someone who had sat at my dinner table, laughed at my jokes, and all the while plotted to destroy everything I loved. Carlos remained motionless, staring back at me with cold, empty eyes. Pictures of my family were pinned to the wall, snapshots taken from across the street, through windows and parking lots. A detailed map of my son's school hung beside them, with routes and schedules carefully marked. He scrambled for a weapon when we burst in, but we moved too fast. Once he was cuffed, I finally had the chance to meet his gaze. He wouldn't say a word, not even a plea. His calm stare was more unsettling than if he had screamed. The nightmare had begun 10 days earlier when my 9-year-old son Ethan didn't come home from school. At first, I assumed he stayed late for soccer practice. When the school office told me they hadn't seen him leave, my stomach twisted into knots. I rushed over, combed every hallway, and checked in with the few teachers who remained. He was nowhere. I put out an alert, enlisted the help of colleagues, and started a city-wide search. The department worked around the clock. Days slipped by with no word or sign of Ethan. I'd never known a terror like that. My chest felt constantly hollow and I barely slept. Each hour that passed without finding him chipped away at me. On the 6th day of the search, we got a tip that Victor Viper Delgado's gang might have orchestrated the kidnapping in retaliation for his arrest. Just 2 weeks earlier, I'd made headlines for arresting Delgado during a routine traffic stop. He was the rumored leader of a violent burglary ring that had been terrorizing local neighborhoods in Austin. I had a feeling he wouldn't go down without a fight, but I never imagined he'd target my family. The nights were the worst. Lying awake at 3 a.m. watching the ceiling fan circle, I'd blame myself for what happened. Delgado was behind bars, but maybe his crew wanted to teach me a lesson. That kind of guilt sinks in deep, like a stone in your chest. Lydia tried to be supportive, but we both felt utterly helpless. Then, 10 days after Ethan disappeared, I was in my bedroom going through some old case files. Lydia was staying with her sister for a night. She needed a break from the tension. Around midnight, I heard a soft thump from somewhere below. My heart rate kicked up, but I tried to stay rational. Another sound followed, louder, definitely coming from the basement. Grabbing my flashlight and gun, I headed down quietly, one step at a time, trying not to let my imagination run wild. I reached the bottom and flicked on the overhead light. At first, everything looked normal, just shelves of old photo albums, holiday decorations, and a few bins. Then I heard a muffled whimper coming from behind a row of boxes. My throat went dry. I inched closer, stepping around a half-broken coffee table we'd meant to toss out. There, in the far corner, was Ethan. He was tied up, his wrists and ankles bound with rough rope, an old cloth gag around his mouth, dark bruises visible on his arms. His eyes locked onto mine, wide with fear and relief. I nearly dropped to my knees. The terror, the relief, the confusion, it all slammed into me at once. I managed to steady my hands long enough to untie him and remove the gag. He clung to me, shaking so hard I could feel his heartbeat against my chest. When he finally spoke, his voice was raspy and faint. He said he'd been picked up from school by our housemate Carlos, but Carlos had driven him somewhere unfamiliar and locked him in a dark place. Carlos had kept him blindfolded most of the time, only giving him water and stale bread once a day. Carlos had been living with us for months. We'd hired him through a domestic services agency because Lydia and I both worked long hours. He had become almost like family, sharing meals with us, helping Ethan with homework, even joining our weekend barbecues. I ran upstairs, gun drawn, checking every room. No sign of Carlos. I called the station, and within minutes, units were surrounding my house, scouring the property. His room was empty, clothes gone, toiletries missing. He'd been planning this escape. Over the next few days, we discovered that Carlos had never really been employed by any agency. His paperwork was all fake. He'd wormed his way into our home specifically to get close to my family. And his real name wasn't even Carlos. He was an ex-con with known ties to Delgado's gang. The deeper we dug, the more horrifying it became. This had all been orchestrated from the start, a year-long infiltration just to strike at the perfect moment. The most chilling part was finding the hidden cameras. Carlos had installed tiny surveillance devices throughout our house. In the kitchen, the living room, even our bedroom. He'd been watching us, learning our routines, our vulnerabilities. There were notebooks filled with details about our daily lives. When we left for work, which friends visited regularly, what medications we took. He knew everything about us. It took almost 2 weeks of tireless searching to finally track Carlos down to an abandoned hunting cabin in the Balcones Canyonlands. A local hiker reported suspicious activity. Someone sneaking around a cabin off a trail that wasn't on any official map. At the station, Carlos refused to cooperate. He denied everything. As for Delgado, he kept his mouth shut behind bars. We put the house up for sale. Neither of us could stand to stay there. Every creak, every shadow felt like a threat. Sometimes, late at night, I remember how it all started with that traffic stop. Nabbing Delgado felt like a win, but it came at a crushing cost. The question that still haunts me is how many more people were involved? People I might have trusted? People I saw every day before I realized they were part of this same network? It's that question, unanswered and echoing in my thoughts, that keeps me awake. The evil that can wear a smile, pour your coffee, and plan your destruction, all at the same time. I peered through the narrow opening of Nathan's office door, barely breathing, my pulse quickening with each moment. Nathan was standing by his desk with 2 rough-looking men I'd never seen before. The men were hunched over, examining something on Nathan's desk. Cash, a lot of cash, and what looked like driver's licenses and passports spread across the surface. In the corner, a duffel bag lay open, and I could see something that made my blood run cold. A small shoe, a child's shoe, poking out from beneath some clothes. Nathan's expression was cold, focused, nothing like the friendly boss I thought I knew. "The merchandise arrives tomorrow night," he said in a low voice. "This time make sure the van's ready. We can't afford another delay." My heart dropped, adrenaline surging. As quietly as I could, I backed away and returned to my workstation, pretending to pack boxes while trying to calm my nerves. Within minutes, the 2 men left through the back entrance, glancing briefly in my direction as they passed. One of them had a jagged scar across his neck. The other carried a duffel bag clutched tightly to his chest. Nathan never came out of his office that night, and I avoided looking his way as I left at 6 a.m. I'd been working the night shift at this small warehouse outside Boise for about 5 months, ever since April of 2022. My shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., which honestly wasn't too bad. The place was quiet at night, peaceful even. Mostly just me and a couple of others handling orders, packing boxes, and sorting inventory. Nathan Reeves was the kind of boss you'd instantly trust. He had a fatherly vibe about him. Late 40s, glasses, always neatly dressed in a button-up and jeans. On my first night, he shook my hand firmly, smiled warmly, and made sure I knew my way around the place. Nathan would regularly check in, bring us coffee or snacks, and always asked how we were doing, like genuinely asked. I liked Nathan. Everyone did. Things went smoothly for months. I settled into a comfortable routine. Clock in, grab coffee, handle packages, and chat occasionally with coworkers. Nathan usually stuck around until midnight, making sure everything ran smoothly before heading home. Life was predictable, easygoing, and safe. Or at least that's what I believed. By mid-August, something started feeling off. Nathan began lingering longer into the night. At first, he just stayed until 1 or 2 a.m., quietly working in his office with the blinds shut tight. But the longer he stayed, the more withdrawn he became. His easy smile faded, replaced by tense expressions and occasional irritated sighs. One night in September around 3 a.m. I stepped out back for some fresh air. It was chilly and quiet. That's when I noticed Nathan's truck parked way off near the far edge of our lot, partially hidden behind dumpsters. He usually parked near the entrance. I stood there puzzled, my breath visible in the crisp air. I could see Nathan inside his truck, arguing on the phone. He was angry, gesturing harshly with one hand, his face twisted with a hostility I'd never seen. Then I noticed something else, a dark stain on his shirt sleeve that looked suspiciously like blood. As he shifted in his seat, I caught a glimpse of what looked like a handgun on the passenger seat. Rumors among coworkers surfaced, whispers about shady visitors coming in at odd hours when most staff had already left. One coworker, Trent, swore he saw Nathan handing over sealed boxes to unfamiliar people in unmarked vans around 4 a.m. On one occasion, Trent thought he heard muffled crying coming from one of those boxes, but it was too quick to be certain. The next shift after I witnessed the meeting in Nathan's office, he was back to normal. Friendly greetings, casual smiles, handing out coffee like always. It was disorienting seeing him flip back so easily, like watching someone put on a mask. 4 days, I convinced myself I'd misread the situation, but the image of him counting stacks of cash at night, surrounded by suspicious strangers, and that tiny shoe wouldn't leave my mind. Then one night in November around 3:45 a.m., I was alone in the warehouse finishing up inventory logs. Nathan hadn't been in that night, which wasn't unusual anymore. As I marked off a shipment, the loading dock door suddenly creaked open. My heart froze. No deliveries were scheduled at this hour. Slow footsteps echoed through the warehouse, heavy and deliberate. I hid behind a shelf, gripping a box cutter tightly. The footsteps paused near Nathan's office, followed by the faint jingling of keys. I peered cautiously around the shelf. It was Nathan. He looked disheveled, hair messy, clothes rumpled, a dark smear across his cheek that could have been dirt or dried blood. He unlocked his office and vanished inside, leaving the door ajar. Seconds later, loud bangs came from his office. Drawers slammed open, files scattered onto the floor. He was searching frantically for something. From my hiding spot, I could see into his office through the gap in the door. What I saw made my skin crawl. Pinned to his corkboard were photographs of children, dozens of them with notes and markings I couldn't make out. He was tearing them down, stuffing them into a bag. Finally, he rushed out holding a thick envelope tightly against his chest, glancing around nervously before hurrying outside to his truck. He never came back after that night. No one heard from him again. His phone went straight to voicemail. A raspy, garbled sound came from behind us. Not quite speech, but no words I could recognize. I glanced back and saw a figure at the end of the hallway, a silhouette darker than the surrounding shadows. It moved in a disjointed way, lurching forward with unnatural speed. We scrambled down to the first floor, nearly slipping on broken pieces of glass and debris. My heart pounded so hard I felt dizzy, and Ryan's ragged breathing told me he was just as terrified. Whatever was behind us wasn't making footstep sounds anymore, just a wet, sliding noise that echoed through the stairwell. Once we were outside, we sprinted to the car without saying a word. I risked one final glance at the building and saw movement behind one of the third-floor windows, a pale shape pressed against the glass, too elongated to be human. Only when we were safely locked in the car did I dare to breathe again. "Did you see that?" Ryan's voice cracked. "What the hell was that?" I turned the ignition with trembling hands and we drove off. We didn't talk much on the way home, both too shaken to process what had happened. It had started earlier that evening. My friend Ryan had sent me a link to an online forum post about an abandoned building near downtown Albuquerque. Supposedly, it used to be an old pharmaceutical research facility that went bankrupt decades ago. The post mentioned strange noises coming from inside at night. Some folks blamed rats or stray dogs. Others hinted at squatters. I've always been drawn to old, forgotten places. The quiet emptiness fascinates me. It's like a puzzle trying to figure out what happened there and why it was left behind. Ryan and I made plans to check it out. We didn't exactly advertise our plan because we knew it was a terrible idea, but we convinced ourselves we'd just go in, look around, and leave quickly. We parked about a block away on a deserted side street. The weather was cold enough to see our breath in the air, and the sky was a dull gray. The building itself was massive, 5 stories tall with broken windows and graffiti all over its concrete facade. There was a padlock chain on the front doors, but we found a gap in a side window that had been busted out. Inside, the place smelled like mildew and stale air, and something else, something chemical and acrid that burned the back of my throat. Our flashlights cut through dust particles floating in the darkness. Pieces of drywall were scattered on the floor, and rusty machinery stood in the corners, silent and forgotten. Shattered glass vials crunched beneath our feet, and dark stains marked the floors and walls. We started exploring the upper floors. We located a creaky metal staircase near the back. On the second floor, we stumbled across a large open area with rows of hospital-style beds, all rusted and overturned. 4 stands lay toppled, and restraints dangled from some of the bed frames. Up on the third floor, things got unsettling. We noticed footprints in the thick dust like somebody had walked through recently. The footprints looked strange, uneven with an odd drag pattern as if whoever made them was limping badly or not walking quite right. We followed them, our flashlights trembling just a little. As we rounded a corner, we saw a door at the end of the corridor. Something metallic glinted beneath the sliver of light from outside. The footprints disappeared abruptly, almost like whoever made them had stepped off into a side room, but there was no door or gap in the wall for them to vanish into. It was too quiet, except for the faint drip of water leaking somewhere behind us, and a subtle rhythmic sound I couldn't quite place, like breathing but not quite human. Ryan tapped my shoulder and pointed down at the floor. There was a discarded flashlight lying there as if someone had dropped it. I knelt and picked it up. The thing still had a battery left because I could see a weak flicker when I pressed the switch. At that moment, a dull scraping sound came from further down the hall, near the door. It reminded me of someone dragging something heavy across the concrete, or fingernails dragging along a wall. We both froze. Ryan gestured for me to turn off my flashlight, so I did. We stood in darkness for a few seconds, listening. The scraping continued, slow and deliberate, punctuated by a wet, gurgling sound. I leaned forward, trying to peer through the gloom. My eyes adjusted enough to see that the door was slightly open. There wasn't any light coming from inside the room, just blackness. A part of me wanted to call out, but something about that sound told me to stay quiet. Then it stopped. Dead silence again. Then a soft thump. And another. Footsteps, but all wrong, too heavy, too uneven. Coming toward us. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the image of that figure or the sounds it made. I researched the history of the building and discovered disturbing details. The pharmaceutical company hadn't just gone bankrupt. It had been shut down after allegations of illegal human testing. Several employees had reportedly gone missing before the closure, and there were sealed court documents that hinted at containment breaches. Ryan and I never went back, but others did. 2 months after our visit, a local news story reported that 3 college students had gone missing after exploring an abandoned building on the outskirts of town. The police search found nothing except a single shoe and, chillingly, a dropped flashlight with fresh batteries. I still drive by that place sometimes, always in daylight, always moving quickly. The windows seem empty, but occasionally, just at the edge of my vision, I think I see movement inside. Something watching, waiting for its next visitors. Whatever was in that hallway, whatever made those uneven footprints, I'm certain of one thing. It wasn't human. At least not anymore. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the photographs on the camera's memory card. What began as nature photography devolved into something sinister. Nighttime surveillance images. Photographs taken from concealed positions, through branches and between fence slats, focusing on specific houses. Each sequence advanced closer to particular windows, the progression methodical and predatory. My unease intensified when I reached a series showing a woman's bedroom, curtains partially drawn, interior dimly lit. The invasion of privacy was shocking. Subsequent images captured her unaware, sleeping, changing clothes, all photographed without consent. Then horror truly struck. The bedroom in these images was horrifyingly familiar. Identical layout to mine, same wall color, identical furniture arrangement. Even the distinctive painting above the bed, a watercolor my mother had created, was clearly visible. These weren't random photographs. This was unmistakably my bedroom, my private space violated repeatedly. Panic surged through me as I rushed to my bedroom, pulse thundering in my ears. The window faced the dense woods behind my property, perfect concealment for someone watching, photographing, documenting my most vulnerable moments. The timestamps indicated these photos were taken just 3 weeks ago. I secured the camera in a plastic bag, preserving potential fingerprints, and drove immediately to the Lakeside Heights Police Department. I had purchased the Canon EOS just hours earlier at an estate sale in a nearby neighborhood on Evergreen Court. Nothing remarkable about the property, gray siding, black shutters, a modest split-level home, but the garage overflowed with containers and miscellaneous household goods. The man overseeing the sale appeared haggard and unshaven, nervously checking his watch repeatedly. When I inquired about the camera, he flinched visibly. "It was my brother's," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. "Just take it. $30 and it's gone." $30 for a professional DSLR was suspiciously cheap, but the opportunity seemed too good to refuse. I paid and departed, feeling vaguely uneasy about the transaction. At home, I examined my purchase, charging the battery and powering up the device. The memory card remained installed, containing hundreds of images. Curiosity piqued, I began examining them while drinking coffee, snow falling gently outside my windows. Initially, the photographs seemed ordinary. Landscape shots of northern wilderness, a German shepherd playing in snow, family gatherings around a fireplace. Gradually, however, the images transformed, becoming increasingly unsettling. 4 days after I brought the camera to the police, Detective Marion Ellison requested an urgent meeting. Her typically composed demeanor had fractured, replaced with obvious concern. "The camera belonged to someone named Christopher Vance," she explained carefully. "He lived approximately 2 miles from you until 6 weeks ago when neighbors reported him missing. His brother filed a missing persons report but then mysteriously withdrew it 48 hours later. The brother, the man who sold you the camera, initially claimed Christopher moved suddenly for work. However, under questioning, he admitted discovering the camera's contents and becoming concerned. Rather than bringing it to police, he decided to dispose of it quietly through the estate sale." "But what about the photos? My bedroom?" I demanded, nausea rising. Detective Ellison hesitated before responding. "The most recent images were captured the night before Christopher Vance's disappearance. There's something else you should know." She paused, clearly measuring her words. "When we searched Vance's residence, we discovered journals documenting his surveillance activities spanning 7 years and 23 different victims. Your name appears repeatedly in the most recent entries, alongside increasingly disturbing fantasies. We also found a hidden room containing hundreds of personal items stolen from victims' homes, souvenirs. Nothing belonging to you was discovered, which suggests you were his newest target when something interrupted his pattern." The implications chilled me profoundly. I upgraded my security system that same afternoon. Motion sensors, reinforced windows, cameras monitoring every approach to my property. Each night, I methodically check every lock, every potential entry point. Yet the most terrifying aspect remains unanswered. Christopher Vance vanished without explanation. His brother reported finding blood in Christopher's workshop but cleaned it before authorities could investigate, claiming he panicked. No body has been recovered. No evidence indicates Vance's current whereabouts. Sometimes when snow falls heavily at night, I imagine footprints appearing beneath my window, impressions that materialize without warning and vanish by morning. Is Christopher Vance truly gone? Or is he still watching without his camera, waiting for me to forget he exists? My flashlight illuminated something wrapped in blackened cloth. My pulse quickened painfully as I reached inside the hidden wall compartment, carefully extracting the bundle. It was unexpectedly heavy, the fabric disintegrating at my touch. With shaking fingers, I unfolded one corner, exposing what appeared to be tiny bones nestled inside, too small for an adult but unmistakably human. The skull fragment was partially visible, a child's skull. Someone had deliberately hidden these remains, perhaps decades ago. I dropped the bundle, scrambling backward, my breathing ragged and shallow. Who conceals human remains inside walls? Without delay, I contacted the Ravenwood police. 3 months earlier, I'd bought my first house in this sleepy village, an older Victorian farmhouse with a sprawling, overgrown garden. After living in cramped city apartments for years, finally having my own space felt liberating. The previous owner, a retired archaeologist named Thomas Blackwood, had lived there for nearly 4 decades before relocating to Arizona for health reasons. I renovated extensively, stripping, peeling wallpaper and replacing ancient fixtures, gradually transforming the house into something that felt like mine. By October, I'd collected enough discarded items to justify hosting a garage sale, a perfect opportunity to purge unwanted possessions and perhaps introduce myself properly to the community. The morning of the sale arrived with an unsettling fog that burned away by 10. Business was moderate. Locals wandered through, making small talk and occasional purchases. Around noon, I noticed an elderly woman approaching from the direction of the cemetery. She wore a threadbare black dress and had silver hair wound tightly into a severe bun. She stood out because in 3 months, I'd never encountered her, and Ravenwood was small enough that strangers were immediately apparent. She ignored the displayed merchandise, walking directly toward me with unnerving purpose, stopping to examine the house with hollow, penetrating eyes. "You're living here now," she stated, her voice like dry leaves scraping across stone. "Yes," I answered, feeling a cold unease despite the warm day. "Moved in about 3 months ago." She nodded slowly, never blinking as she stared at the upper windows. "I used to care for the children who lived here. Many, many years ago." She shifted her gaze back to me, eyes unnaturally pale and distant. "You must check beneath the attic insulation near the chimney stack. Not everything was discovered before." Before I could formulate a question, she turned and walked away as if our conversation had reached its natural conclusion. I called after her, but she continued onward without acknowledgement, disappearing into the mist that had inexplicably returned at the cemetery's edge. That night, after the last customer had gone, her cryptic message consumed me. I found myself standing in the attic, flashlight trembling in my grip, scanning the dusty rafters. Near the chimney stack, I began tapping against the insulation, listening for anything unusual. After several attempts, I detected a hollow space that shouldn't exist. Now the police arrived, 3 officers methodically photographing, collecting evidence and searching further within the walls. They discovered 2 additional bundles, carefully documenting everything while questioning me about when I'd purchased the property and whether I'd had unusual experiences since moving in. Weeks crawled by before Detective Sinclair finally called with information. The remains belonged to 3 children who had vanished from Ravenwood between 1954 and 1958. The cases had gone cold, the disappearances never solved. The bones showed evidence of ritualistic markings, carved symbols that predated the children's deaths. I immediately contacted Thomas Blackwood, the previous owner. His voice quivered when I explained the discovery, insisting he knew nothing about hidden remains or ritual markings. He ended our conversation abruptly, sounding genuinely frightened. I searched historical records obsessively, learning the house had changed ownership frequently until Blackwood purchased it in 1983. Previous residents rarely stayed longer than 18 months. Town rumors suggested the property was troubled, though specific incidents went undocumented. I waited for the elderly woman to reappear, hoping for explanations, but she never materialized. None of my neighbors recognized my description. Several crossed themselves nervously when I mentioned her appearance near the cemetery. Even now, 2 years later, those remains haunt me. Why were children's bones hidden within the walls? How did the woman know their location? But more disturbing than these questions is the phrase that awakens me during violent thunderstorms: not everything was discovered before. If those children's remains weren't what she meant, what else lies concealed within these walls, beneath these floors, inside this house that sometimes whispers when no one is speaking?